Welcome to Everything Co-op, bringing you information on how cooperatives can help improve your quality of life. This show is being sponsored by the National Co-op Bank, NCB. The NCB is dedicated to strengthening communities nationwide for the delivery of banking and financial services for the nation's cooperatives, their members, and other socially responsible organizations. For more information on the power of community ownership, visit ncb.coop. That's ncb.coop. Now stay tuned for your host, Vernon Oakes.
Good morning. Good morning, everybody. This is Vernon Oakes. Welcome to Everything Co-op this beautiful, beautiful Thursday morning. This morning, we have Dr. Jessica Gordon-Nembhard as our guest. Good morning, Jessica.
Good morning. And I need to start by saying congratulations. In a couple months, we'll be inducting you into the U.S. Co-op Hall of Fame. Congratulations.
Thank you. I still get excited and butterflies and I have to wipe away the tears when I think about it. It's such a great honor. And the committee that put my application in kept it as a secret all the way until they announced it to me. So yes, thank you very much.
That's the best. Yeah, that's the best. Yeah, I actually cried at my acceptance because it was about 6 months since my mom had died. And they showed a video, and then I think one of the last pictures was me with my family and my mom, and so by the time I got up there to accept, I was just in tears.
Well, I get to join you and all of the people that have been that are heroes of the cooperative movement, and that is wonderful. And I cried when they told me. Well, I'm a man. I didn't cry. Stuff was in my eyes. Okay. Okay. Now. So with this Co-op Hall of Fame, you and Margaret Lung started the Unsung Heroes. What are the Unsung Heroes?
Yeah, well, it actually was Margaret Lung's idea from my research. She was realizing that, my book was full of all these particularly Black and often women co-op heroes who people hadn't previously known about or known their co-op history. And the Hall of Fame had kind of missed them, right? The Hall of Fame started, when did it start, in the 80s or something?
Well, it's celebrating its 50th year today, so you keep talking and I'll figure it out.
We should know, right? So earlier than that, then. It started in the 70s, then. But missed some of these early heroes.
74.
And so, 74, right. So missed some of the ones, especially in the early 20th century. And so she thought we could create this category, Unsung Heroes, and look back into the past, not just celebrate Black women, though that's who we started with, but to celebrate unsung women in general, unsung people of color in general, unsung co-op people that, had already passed by the time the award was started, and it could remind us, right, of that legacy we have in the United States, that we've been doing this for, 200 years. So she and I wrote up a proposal to the Cooperative Development Fund Board. Actually, I guess it was the National Cooperative Business Association Board. And they agreed that it would be a great category to start. And the other part of our proposal was we were hoping that CDF could set aside some co-op education funds to help pay young scholars and other people to do the research. Because, one, we didn't want to just depend on the research I had been able to do for my book, but we also realized once we stopped finding heroes from my book, there would be other heroes around, and people would need to do that local research to find out about people they might have heard of or whatever, so that we had a holistic view of their life. So we also got a little bit of money set aside each year for people to do the research to create the applications to nominate people. So It's a really nice combination of making sure people realize we've got people in the past that we want to recognize, and then also helping people to uncover that information so we all learn more about those people.
So you've mentioned my research, my book, a couple times already. So
all right.
Your book is called Collective Courage. When did you start the research on that?
Oh gosh, back in the mid 1990s, I had gotten very excited about co-ops. I was working actually for the Children's Defense Fund, the Black Community Crusade for Children. I was economic development analyst right after I got my Ph.D. in economics in the 90s. And I was tasked with trying to figure out community development strategies that were child-friendly, family-friendly, especially for Black communities. And one of the strategies I started learning about was co-ops. I actually had grown up in a cooperative intentional community, and I had bought things at co-op grocery stores, but I hadn't thought of co-ops as an actual community development strategy. And so now I was looking at co-ops as how can it be part of community economic development that really supported families, supported Black folks, etc. And so I started reading, writing, talking to people, and going to conferences. But everywhere I went, I didn't hear much about Black co-ops. And of course, I was thinking of this strategy for Black communities. So I realized I needed to start doing my own research. Luckily, a grad school friend of mine, still a friend and colleague, Curtis Haynes, who's over now at State University of Buffalo State University, he had done his dissertation on W.E.B. Du Bois's economic thought. And Du Bois's economic thought is about co-ops and co-op commonwealth. So I started with talking to Curtis. He told me some things to read of Du Bois, and then from there I started doing more and more research. I was able to get some support eventually when I was at the Democracy Collaborative, a research assistant who was able to go through all the crisis magazines and other Black newspapers and magazines to find me articles about co-ops, and it just what they call the snowball effect. I slowly started able to put the story together, learning more and more about people and co-ops through Black history. So that's why actually the subtitle of the book is A History of African American Cooperative Economic Thought and Practice, because there was as much thought, people talking about the strategy, as there was the practice of actually creating co-ops.
So, you've been on the show before, and I've understood that you were with the Children's Defense Fund, but I hadn't gotten that you're looking at what's best for children, and then what's best for families, and then what's best for communities, and you end up with co-ops.
Right. That's how I started.
Fascinating. Yep. Okay. What's best for children is co-ops. All right, if you take all the other. Children, families, community. And you said you had grown up in an intentional community, but you had... I grew
up in an intentional community, yeah, but I'd never thought of co-ops as an economic strategy. And as I said, I also had used some co-op grocery stores. Actually, when I was at Yale, right, the Yale bookstore is considered a co-op. And there was a food co-op in New Haven that I used to frequent. But again, I never thought of it as part of a whole community economic development strategy until later with this mission I was on with the Black Community Crusade for Children. The importance there was to understand, right, co-ops, the way that they empowered communities, right, to make decisions for themselves, to be economic agents, to control what they were producing or selling or servicing, right, to make decisions about what to produce, how to produce it, how much to sell it for, how much, right, all those things empowered human beings, which also made families stronger, parents stronger, which also then helped their children. And then also co-ops can be very family friendly, right, especially for women involved in co-ops. They can organize their lives, in a way that's supportive of their families and their children while they're doing their economic activities through a co-op. So all those pieces started coming together the more I studied co-ops. And then the missing piece was, well, where are Black folks in that? And so that's when I started doing the official research. I didn't even think I had a book at the time. I was personally curious, and I was trying to have examples for when both the Children's Defense Fund, and then later I worked at Morgan State University in their Institute for Urban Research. And so again, I was trying to find examples for urban community economic development for Black communities. How do you do this? How did people do this? Why did they choose co-ops? What did they get out of having a co-op? And eventually I realized I had information that should be a book.
So once before you told me when you got started in the mid-'90s and you started asking at some point where are black folks, you were told black folks don't do co-ops. That's a hippie thing, a white hippie thing.
Yeah.
Okay.
Black folks told me that. White folks just said they didn't know, and black folks said, oh no, co-ops are a hippie thing.
Okay. And you found out that was not necessarily a true statement, huh?
Absolutely not the truth at all. We have this just long, strong, fascinating history of all kinds of co-ops and cooperative economic activities owned and controlled by black folks throughout our history from when we were brought here in chains.
And we brought it over here on the boats I've gotten from you also. Okay. So I was in St. Paul 6 weeks ago. I think you were there too at the Black
I was there.
Co-op agenda, and one gentleman said, oh, I've been doing co-ops for 40 years. I just didn't have the language. So I found that extremely interesting, that when you look at the principles and how people work together collectively, then we do that automatically in our communities. And that's how we've survived and survived through slavery, working together, helping each other.
Yep.
So
all that collective economic action, collective ownership, sharing, solidarity economics too, just supporting each other, all those pieces. I found that too when I started both interviewing people about this and talking about it in black communities. When I used the word co-op, a lot of people didn't resonate, but when I talked about what the activity was, what the principles were and the values, or told stories about case studies, people would come back and say, oh, that's what you mean. Well, my grandparents did this. My aunt and uncle did that. And so the language was in the way. Again, people thought of co-ops very narrowly and often thought of it as something black folks either didn't do or weren't invited into. But once we talked about the activities and what it was, then people knew. The other thing I also uncovered in the book was the sabotage and the white supremacist terrorism against black co-ops. And that's another reason why I think people didn't resonate to the term, because often a lot of the co-op activity was done underground, under the radar, so they wouldn't get terrorized or sabotaged by white folks who didn't want them to succeed. So often the families were involved in co-op stuff, but they didn't talk about it or they didn't use that word. So they might have called it the store when it was actually a co-op, or they might not have referred to it at all because they had to hide it in order to protect it. So there's also this long history of hidden activity, use of different terminologies in order to protect what was happening.
Wow. So you mentioned W.E.B. Du Bois, but in your book you talk about A. Philip Randolph, the Ladies' Auxiliary to the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters, Nannie Helen Burroughs, Fannie Lou Hamer, Ella Jo Baker. There seems like almost everybody that's anybody, including Martin Luther King, were into co-ops. Is that a true statement?
That was another surprising thing. Basically, I talk about black co-op movement. The black co-op history is also a parallel silent partner to the long civil rights movement. So when I say the civil rights, I don't just mean the 50s on. The long civil rights is everything we did to assert our humanity, just to demand our rights and to resist oppression and enslavement. So throughout the long civil rights movement for human rights, economic justice, especially through cooperatives and collective economics, were all happening at the same time, but often the silent partner, very quiet. There was a great quote from Andrew Young, actually, when he got the Federation of Southern Cooperatives Estelle Witherspoon Award, like 15 years ago. I remember I was there and I heard him say this, and what he said was, it wasn't safe and there wasn't consensus around the economic agenda. A lot of black folks were practicing cooperatives and doing economic justice work, but they didn't think it would make a national campaign. The voting rights, they thought, was the safest national campaign. And so all the civil rights organizations, even though they're members and they were supporting other kinds of economic justice activities. Their national campaign was about voting rights, civil rights, using legal litigation, because that's what they thought they could win. That's what they thought the public would stand for. But meanwhile, quietly and behind the scenes, like the way that all the 5 major civil rights organizations came together to help create the Federation of Southern Cooperatives Land Assistance Fund in the 60s, they were quietly in the background supporting economic justice and cooperatives, but in the foreground and in their major marketing, they were focusing on civil rights because they thought that was what the country was willing to hear. So it was interesting for him to actually lay that out, because clearly I don't think people understood that we were still doing the economic stuff. We just weren't pronouncing it and making a big deal about it.
Wow. Well, I got a chance to meet Andy Young at the Federation of Southern Co-ops annual meeting maybe 6 years ago. And I got a picture with him because he is one of my heroes. So I was very pleased to meet him there. So I got from what you said today and other times that you got a Ph.D. in economics.
Yes.
Then you started working for the Children's Defense Fund. And then you learned about co-ops and the co-op economic thought. So you didn't get this in your formal education. Is that correct?
No. I was actually at the foremost heterodox economics department in the country, UMass Amherst. So we learned about political economy, Marxism, Keynesianism, in addition to neoclassical economics, so that we were well-rounded in all the economic theories, except we didn't study social economics or cooperative economics. I had to learn that on my own.
Do you know if the economic departments are changing to where now they teach?
Yes. Actually, UMass now has a certificate in cooperative economics. So you can start to learn about it while you're studying the other economic systems. Actually, Urban Crow and a bunch of people he worked with from the Pioneer Valley area around Amherst worked with some of the faculty, like Nancy Folbury at UMass, to create that certificate in cooperative economics. So now they've got it.
Do you think that your work has helped them to get it?
I don't try to claim too much, Vernon. If you think that it helped, I think I certainly somehow managed to get the message out there that we need to see cooperatives in this broader notion, right, of being part of a justice movement, part of what subaltern people do in addition to other groups. And I guess I got people talking. You know, I tell people when I wrote the book, I expected maybe 5 people to read it, you know, my parents and maybe a couple other people and maybe a few libraries to have it. So I thought maybe it would sell about 15 or 20 copies at best. I was doing it more because I wanted to know the information and I wanted to be able to tell people we have this legacy and we can do this because we have done it under even worse circumstances. And so that was all I needed. I just wanted to make sure I had the backup information so that when people challenged me, I could say, oh, I know what I'm talking about. Mm-hmm. I've been shocked at how many people have read the book. I mean, we're now actually we're going into our 10th anniversary of the publication, and my press is so impressed with the sales that they're just issuing a 10th anniversary reprint with a new preface that I wrote. So that's coming out, I think, this month. So that's also amazing because academic books usually just sit on the shelves and get forgotten. So any influence has been amazing to me. I'm not sure how much I can claim on anything, but I can claim that people are reading it and talking about it.
Do you have any sense of how many books sold? You expected 15, maybe?
You know, I don't have that number. I just know that it's one of the better selling books of my press, which is Pennsylvania State University Press. They now claim it. Actually, I was just looking at the website to find out when the reprint was coming out, and I noticed that they call it a classic.
Classic.
And as I said, the fact that they're willing to reprint it, they said it's one of their higher selling, but I don't know what that means. I guess that means tens of thousands, maybe, but I honestly don't know what I should claim for how many books have sold.
Okay, but we can honestly.
I also know people are sharing them too, so
we can honestly say more than 50.
More than 15, yes.
Okay. I've bought 4 because every time I let somebody see it, I hold on to it because it disappears. And I remember loaning it to somebody and he never gave it back. So yeah, and I will get the reprint because of the preface. What is the preface about?
So the preface is about my reflections on what's happened to the book and the information over the last 10 years since it was published. So I talk a little bit about how it got more attention than I ever imagined. I talk a little bit about some things I learned that didn't get into the book to sort of update the book. Some connections I made since the book, like the Combahee River colony of black women during the Civil War who took over abandoned plantations and collectively worked the farm and sold their produce and their crafts, right? I didn't realize that the Combahee River, the plantations were abandoned because of something Harriet Tubman did. So I add that information about Harriet Tubman's connection to co-ops in the sense that she was one of the scouts who convinced the Massachusetts and the South Carolina black troops to go and liberate the plantations on the Combahee River. And it's because of that liberation that the black men joined the Union Army and left, and the Confederates and the white plantation owners took their families and left. And the black women and the elderly and children were left on these abandoned plantations, and they just took them over, ran them as co-ops, collectives for the next 3 years until the end of the war. So I talk about those kinds of things that I learned more about. I had a paragraph about the Combahee River Collective, but I didn't realize the connection with Harriet Tubman. So I explained some of those kinds of things. I have some stuff about Marion Barry and Washington, D.C. co-ops, which I had missed. So I update a little bit, and then I mostly reflect on where we're going and the fact that I believe we're in a fourth wave of cooperative economics, especially for black folks, in the 2020s. I talked about 3 other periods of prolific black co-op activity, 1880s, 30s and 40s, and 60s and 70s. And so I also talk in this preface that we're now in the fourth wave.
Okay. What do you see in this fourth? Well, before that, where's the Combahee River?
Oh, South Carolina.
Okay.
In the Gullah region.
Okay. Does it go into Tennessee?
I don't know. Probably.
Okay, because I was at the Federation of Southern Co-ops annual meeting, and they were talking about having some land in Tennessee, and this gentleman, Chief somebody, stood up and said that they wanted to build a hotel on it, and talking about the history, and particularly the history of co-ops, black co-ops. So I'm not sure it's the same river.
I don't know if it's the same river. Yeah, but this one goes out. I can't remember if it's north or south of Charleston. I think it's north of Charleston. So it's not one of the rivers in Charleston, but it's in South Carolina, near the Sea Islands. It comes out somewhere by the Sea Islands near Charleston. Harriet Tubman's raid is a fabulous story about, a woman's ability to scout and plan.
She planned the raid?
Major.
She planned the raid?
Yeah, she planned the raid and was the head of the scouts who scouted the whole area and told the army when to go, what to expect, that whole thing. Yeah. It's an incredible story. And then the outcome of it being these women running these co-ops in the lands that she liberated. They liberated 700 black people in that military move that she planned. Yeah. And the liberation turned into these co-op activity. It's just a fantastic story.
Okay. Would like to, if we could tell elementary school students and middle school students these stories, that'd be fascinating.
Yeah. And again, it's back to these connections between, right, people who were agentic in doing civil rights and justice for blacks also being connected to economic cooperation and co-ops. So it's,
Everything fits.
Places where all these things intersect again.
So this is what we can find in this new edition.
Yes.
And you expect it this
yeah.
week, this month, next month. We're already almost at the end of this month.
Yeah, hopefully this month. If not, I guess next month. They're saying this month on the website. Yeah, and actually we should call it a reprint. It's not really a new edition. What's new is the preface.
All right. I thoroughly enjoyed talking to you because you have so much history. And it's interesting to me that 1995, the middle of the 1990s, that you knew nothing about this. You knew nothing, and you did all of this research
Absolutely
to find
nothing.
out about it.
And I'm not technically a historian, right? A couple people got mad at me because I'm not officially an historian, but I also learned the tools and did all the research. So,
so we've done this talk about your history and your book and your research. We're going to take a break, and we're going to come back and talk about the unsung hero, the ones that have already been designated unsung heroes, and the one for this year, Nannie Helen Burroughs. We'll be right back. Please don't touch that dial. Welcome back, everybody. This is Vernon Oakes, and the program is Everything Co-op, and we are talking to Dr. Jessica Gordon-Nembhard today. We're talking about unsung heroes at the Co-op Hall of Fame. Dr. Nembhard, we're going to be on the air this October 11 years. You're talking about in 1995 or so, you knew nothing about co-ops and you weren't planning on doing a book. I definitely was not planning on doing a radio show. I didn't have any training for it. I was just in the studio talking about housing co-ops to my cousin Pat Thornton's show, Thornton Business Hour, on this same radio station. And the lady that runs the station came out and told me I should have my own show. That's where the idea came from. We were
Congratulations,
we were only going to do it for 1 month, the month of October. This was in June. We were doing it for 1 month. Went to Chuck Snyder, to National Co-op Bank, and said, would you fund this 1 month show? And he did. National Co-op funded it, and they've been our main sponsor all of these 11 years. Not only financial, but they've been our main cheerleader, giving us ideas of who to talk to and what to talk about, and all of these kind of things. And they've done it in such a nice way. They didn't come and say, you need to do this. Why don't you think about this? It was always a suggestion. It allowed us to decide who we wanted to be on the show, and it's our show. So they've just been wondering. NCB's mission is to support co-ops and their members, U.S. co-ops and their members, by providing innovative financial services, particularly in low-income communities. And that turns out to be Black, Brown, and Indigenous community.
Right.
So I like their mission. I like what they're about. And they started in the mid-'80s. So they've been an absolutely great partner, as have you. So let's talk about the unsung heroes.
So once we got the proposal passed, I guess it's 3 years ago now, right? I put in about 3 nominations the first year, and the first one to win was
Ella Jo
Baker. Right? Again, one of those people we know about all the stuff she did in the civil rights movement and her support of SNCC and that kind of thing. What we didn't know, or certainly I didn't know, but most people didn't know, was that in the 1930s, she was co-founder and executive director of the Young Negroes Cooperative League, one of my favorite organizations, in addition to her being one of my favorite people. And so we were able to get her in and talk about again. In her case, she's actually one of the ones who it's kind of reversed. Most of the other ones you'll hear about in a minute came to co-ops after doing something else. She started kind of her career in co-ops and then brought what she learned about economic democracy and self-determination and economic agency and collectivism to all the other things she did in her life. So in the 30s, she had just recently moved up to Harlem from having grown up in North Carolina and gone to Shaw University for undergrad. And I don't even know how she got involved in co-ops, or I don't remember, but she actually won one of those scholarships to go to a co-op training program at CLUSA. That's what NCBA was called in those days, Cooperative League of the USA. So she went and did a co-op training program. A guy named George Schuyler, who also lived in Harlem but was a columnist for the Pittsburgh Courier, joined with her and said, we should really get young people spurring us on to do co-op development. It's the best thing for black folks. So she and he started the Young Negroes Cooperative League. And I believe she took all that knowledge about grassroots economic participation and leadership and democratic governance and brought that up through into the civil rights movement, so that by the early 60s and her consulting with SNCC, right, Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, she's now known as, right, she's a shero in grassroots leadership development, right? And so I claim that she really got all that training and notion and understanding of how democratic grassroots leadership can work because of all the work she did for the 5 years at the Young Negroes Cooperative League in the 30s. So we honored her for that and more. She helped to develop lots of different co-ops. She was on co-op boards and education committees in Harlem for 40 years, things like that. So hard to beat that. Then we went the other direction the second year and inducted Helena Wilson, totally unknown, but she was president of the International Ladies Auxiliary to the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters Labor Union for 30 years, from the 30s to the early 60s, and worked very closely with A. Philip Randolph. And she had the Ladies Auxiliary, basically was a co-op, a promotion. She had the women promoting co-op development as one of their major tasks for all those 30 years that she was president. So she started 17 study groups in 17 different Brotherhood chapters. She helped the Brotherhood to start credit unions, buying clubs and grocery stores, and she also was one of the co-founders of a co-op eye clinic that was run by a coalition of labor unions in Chicago in the 1940s. So she was somebody who grew up in the mutual aid movement, and then she and her husband were strong labor advocates, and she understood the connection between labor and co-ops and how important it was for black folks not just to win labor unions and good wages, but to keep those good wages circulating in the black community. The best way to do that was through co-ops.
Fascinating, because I knew nothing about her until she was inducted as an unsung hero. Yeah, she did a lot.
Yeah, no, it's a fascinating story of a woman who came up, working class woman who just believed in the power of collective action and collective ownership and pushed it through no matter what, even when some of the men in the Brotherhood weren't that excited about it. She just kept pushing, and she did combined education with co-op development. Very, very inspiring person. And again, unknown. I actually learned about her through a colleague of mine, Mindy Chateauvert, who wrote the book about the Ladies Auxiliary of Brotherhood, Ladies Auxiliary to the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters. And one day when she heard I was talking about studying black co-ops, she said, "Oh, you study Helena Wilson," because she was doing co-op development. And so I was able to learn a lot from that, and then went to the archives and things like that and got more details into what she was doing. So that was our last year's Unsung Hero. And this year, Nannie Helen Burroughs won and will be inducted on October 3rd of 2024. And Nannie Helen Burroughs is one of those people who started out in civil rights and women's rights, and then realized that you couldn't do the women's self-empowerment work that she wanted to do just through education alone. Women had to control their own economics, and what's the best way to do that? Through co-ops.
So I didn't know about Helena Wilson. I knew a little bit about Ella Jo Baker, but I knew a lot about Nannie Helen Burroughs because I live 6 blocks away from her school. And in
Right.
2 years, I helped do the budget for the school. And I visited the school, but I didn't know anything about her activities in a co-op until you brought this up. You all brought this in and read about her in your book and so forth. But I knew about her. There's the street that I take from the interstate is Nannie Helen Burroughs Avenue in D.C. So it's real close. And so I see her name every day.
She's a D.C. hero for the work she did in education. She started the National Training School for Women and Girls in 1909 in Washington, D.C. I think it's now called the Nannie Helen Burroughs School. Mm-hmm. She's got the street named after her. But again, and people really see her as, talking about empowering women, both through education and leadership development. And even at the school, they were teaching them how to be better at the jobs that black women could get. So she was known for all that. But what they didn't know was in the basement of the school, by the 1930s, she was also running a co-op. Eventually became called Cooperative Industries of D.C. because it was a set of what I guess in those days they would have called cottage industries, right? There was canning, sewing. They had a special barrel chair making, laundry, and some other things. She ran as a set of worker co-ops for women, especially during the Great Depression, who needed income, needed work. She also really believed that for women to be empowered, they needed to control their own work. So the domestic service, as much as she wanted to make sure she wasn't denigrating homemaking, she didn't think domestic service was a fair job for women because they were so dependent on men, and black women were so dependent on and at the mercy of white men and white women who hired them. And so she was trying to figure out first how to elevate the quality of homemaking, but eventually through the co-op, she wanted women to own their own businesses, start doing productive industrial businesses to get them out of other people's homes and out of those precarious, unsafe, and not well-paying jobs. So it's really, again, another interesting place where she saw not just education and civil rights as important, but economic justice, economic self-determination through cooperative ownership. And she was focusing in the 30s on worker ownership when most people were focusing on consumer co-ops.
So what's interesting to me also, she started a school, and in the basement of the school, she had co-op businesses. Right. So many places in the South would start a store, food co-op, and in the basement of that store, they'd have a school because it had to be kept secret, okay? Because you couldn't educate black folks, so they kept it a secret. They said they had the store, and then they'd have the school hidden in the basement, the education activities going on. So what kind of co-ops did she start so women could have control over their destiny?
Right. So sewing, canning. There's this barrel chair. I keep forgetting to look for a picture of what specifically is a barrel chair, but they only made barrel chairs. I don't think they made any other furniture. And I don't know why. There must be some kind of caning or something involved. I guess there's some kind of handicraft involved in the barrel chairs. But she also had laundry, so they did laundry. And, beauty. So barbershops and beauty parlors. So a bunch of different activities, right? Mm-hmm. That's why, in the end they called them cooperative industries because they were a set of industries. Originally the name was Northeast Self-Help Cooperative. And I can't remember, I think the first co-op was the sewing one and the second one was the canning, because she also boasted that they hired more people in the sewing than any other co-op in D.C. And in the 30s, there were a lot of different co-ops sprouting up. They had 50, at their height, they had 50 sewers. They also were the largest canning producer in D.C. at the time. and they were selling these barrel chairs all over the country, because when I went to her archives and looked in her papers, I was seeing orders from people. One was this fabulous letter from somebody in Baltimore saying that it was the only place they could get high quality chairs, and how much would they sell them? Would she sell them in bulk to them if they bought a certain amount? And then I think there was a letter from somebody in the Carolinas trying to get an order in for the chairs. So really interesting that it wasn't just sort of a local co-op, or some of the co-ops weren't just local, even though some of them were doing very local things like laundry and sewing. So that was interesting. She also, once they became Cooperative Industries of DC, they changed the name because they also became what we would now call the multi-stakeholder co-op. They got $19,000 from the Federal Self-Help Cooperatives Initiative and bought a farm in Maryland. And so they did farming. They also did a consumer co-op. They also sold their farm produce, and they were able to move some of their activities, like the laundry, out from the basement of the school. So they expanded and so became Cooperative Industries of DC, were able to do more. But the archives also showed me it took her 3 years to get that funding from the feds. The FDR administration, the New Deal, had put in this self-help cooperative division under Commerce, this Department of Commerce, but it was harder for black folks to get the money. So she had multiple meetings with them. She put in applications every year. She wrote them letters asking why they weren't considering her group, and finally they got, a substantial sum in the 1930s. $19,000 is nothing to whatever about, but they wouldn't have gotten it if Nannie Helen Burroughs hadn't been so persistent and insisted that they be seen. So all over the country, other groups, especially white groups, were getting money to do co-ops, and the FDR administration also started those model city, green city projects like Greenbelt, which were co-op cities. There were about 6 of them at their height, but Greenbelt is one of the only few that still exist. But this was all happening at the same time, and she was determined that black urban co-op would get some of this money.
So do you think that her friendship with Eleanor Roosevelt helped her to get that money?
Maybe, but in her papers, there's nothing in there that shows that Eleanor wrote a letter of support or anything like that. She doesn't drop Eleanor's name in any of the letters I read. There's no letter from Eleanor Roosevelt. So, maybe it helped, but it doesn't seem like it was the major thing. It seems like it was her arguments and persistence.
Yeah, she had to be persistent with everything that she was doing. And that farm in Maryland, do you think what made the canning so well, they took the produce from the farm and canned it?
That's a great, probably. I don't have any total evidence of that, but it's a nice assumption. I think we could probably say that she did that.
Oh, and I also read, I think in your book, that she had a broom co-op. They made brooms. I was surprised to see that one. I didn't know about the barrel chairs.
Right. Yeah, you're right. Brooms was another one. They were really doing anything that either they had women who had skills at or that women needed, because that was the other thing. They were trying to do both, right? What do we need? What do you need in your household that you can't get? Let's make it. They even did some barter. Like if you worked in the sewing part, you could use some of the time you were logging sewing to buy, to get a free broom or a free chair or whatever, or a reduced price. So they were really looking at, so what do we need, right? It's the height of the Great Depression. People didn't have money. They didn't have jobs. The purpose of this co-op was to provide mutual helpfulness and, provide employment and wealth distribution. And so they really were looking, what do we know how to do? What can we learn how to do? What can we do better? And what do we need? And so trying to produce the things they needed by, producing them themselves, and then sharing and cooperating and discounting so everybody had access to the stuff they needed. So it was a really interesting kind of miniature co-op commonwealth, really, right? With everybody doing their part, but also being able to have access. So access to the fresh food from the farm, access to the other products in addition to what they were doing in their own work. And she also had a couple of big names on her board to help make sure that the society, you know, had the leadership and the prestige, I guess, that it needed to keep going and to raise the money. So H.D. Woodson, who people in D.C. know, a famous businessman, and there's a high school named after him. Mm-hmm. He was her vice president for many years. And then the great historian from Howard University, Chancellor Williams, actually, when he heard about the Northeast Self-Help Co-op, he wrote her a letter. I have a beautiful copy of it, saying he heard about all that she's doing and that co-ops are a great idea and whatever he can do to help. And so at one point she enlisted him to be vice president of the whole operation. So she really, again, had this really interesting hybrid multi-stakeholder model at every level, right? Not just in the work that they did, but who was involved in the co-op and, you know, all the different ways that people worked together and helped each other. So really interesting. And it was a nonprofit model. So again, that's why the bartering and the helping each other and making sure people had access both to the jobs and to what they needed. It was a really interesting, very unique, probably one of the most unique co-op models I found in all my research.
She just sounds extremely powerful, highly intelligent, brave and courageous, okay, particularly in those times as a black woman,
right,
fighting
and
the feds.
A dark-skinned black woman, right? She was a dark-skinned black woman who had trouble even getting a teaching job because people in those days in D.C. thought lighter-skinned black women made better teachers. So she had all kinds of struggles of her own, and yet she persisted in this and persisted in the area of economics and business, right, where most people wouldn't think women should belong. She also had been, you know, the founder of the National Baptist Women's Convention in 1900, so she had that leadership and sense of women's empowerment already in her, but to put it toward first education, founding a school, being the president and principal of a school, and then founding and being the president of a co-op society, a set of co-ops. It's just amazing when you think about those combinations and how important she thought those combinations were to what her ultimate goal was, which was women's and black people's liberation and well-being.
The school is still there, okay? Yeah. Do you have any sense that what happened to these businesses?
Seems like once the Great Depression was over, so by 1939, it seems that the business started to go under, and by 1940, it was done. I think two things happened. If I remember correctly, there were some letters in her papers that the board of her school was not so happy having the co-op in their basement, even though the co-op was paying rent, and or the co-op stopped being able to afford to pay rent. So there is something about the co-op operating in the basement of the school and trying to see if they had enough space at the farm and stuff like that. So I think some things happened as the Depression got lessened and people got opportunities other places and stuff. Maybe there was not as much need for the co-op. They had more trouble keeping up the money, and then they were no longer connected with the school, and then slowly it seemed to petered out. I don't know if they sold the farm or what happened. I couldn't find any information about what happened to the farm. So it seems like it was one of those things where it lasted while it was needed and while it had enough support, and then it didn't. I don't know sort of how else to say it.
Yeah.
And we're running out of time, and so I did want to say one other thing that I forgot to say was also how important co-op education was to her. She actually started some co-op study groups and had a class at the school on cooperative economics and co-op management. So she's another one that also saw the importance of co-op education in all this.
And so co-op education, that's the fifth co-op principle out of 7 principles, and that's the one that caught my eye, education, training, and information. So yeah, that turned out to be, well, you've said in your book, that turned out to be the key to success of co-ops.
Right.
these co-op study groups to help them get started and continue.
And continue, exactly. And her co-op had a provision to put money back into education. I think it was 2% of proceeds would always go back into education. So, yeah, really interesting. Again, notions of that we need to learn together, we need to keep learning, in addition to all the other things we need to do to make sure our business is going well and that we're helping each other and distributing the wealth.
So did she ever marry and have children?
I believe not.
She probably had 100 or two in her school.
Okay. Right, I was going to say she had, right, her students were her children and her co-ops were her babies. How about that?
Yes. 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 Dr. Nembhard, what message would you like to leave people with?
Well, there's probably a lot of messages. We only have, a minute or two left. So what I'll focus on is about the message from the unsung heroes, right? I was going to say we can find, but let me just say we have unsung co-op heroes throughout every period of U.S. history, through every demographic, right? And what they all seem to have in common, right, is this unfailing belief that cooperatives and collective ownership and working together, making decisions together is essential to Black and human progress and well-being. And not only do they believe it, but they make it happen. So they put their money where their mouth is. They put their time and energy where their mouth is. I have been so inspired, right, by those visions, but also by the practice, by the unfailing that people who did everything they could to make sure these co-ops started, worked, succeeded. Even people like a Nannie Helen Burroughs, she didn't have to go into co-ops at all. She was already well known, right? She had started the National Training School for Women and Girls. She started the National Baptist Convention. She was already an achiever, but she wanted to go further because she wanted to make meaningful, long-lasting change, and she saw co-ops as part of that. So we have this legacy we have models of how to do this in a collective way that helps everybody, and we have models of the people who persisted under the worst conditions, right? Being a dark-skinned Black woman in the 1930s in the Depression, right? It can't get much harder than that. But she never stopped, kept going.
Never stop, keep going.
We've
got to go. We'll see you next Thursday. Please live cooperatively. And thank you, Dr. Nembhard.
Thank you.
The preceding program was paid for by Everything Co-op.